without any further ado, I want to introduce our speaker this evening. Robert Morrison is a British Academy Global Professor at Bath University, where I am also based. He is at work currently. In fact, this is what you would be doing this evening were you not here, on the first collected edition of the letters of Thomas De Quincey. And he also recently guest edited a special issue of the journal Romanticism that was devoted to the bicentenary of the publication of De Quincey's most famous work, Confessions of an English Opium-Eater, which was published 200 years ago this year. His most recent book, that's Rob's, not Thomas De Quincey's, The Regency Revolution, was shortlisted for the Historical Writers Association Crown Award and named by The Economist as one of its books of the year for 2019. I'm going to hand over to Rob. I will be chairing us both physically and virtually throughout the meeting. And then when we get to questions at the end, obviously you will be able to raise questions, but I'll also be fielding questions from those of us who are joining online. But Rob.
Thank you very much, Ian. It's a great pleasure for me to be back in England. This is a talk that I was meant to give in March of 2020, and then it blew up, and that didn't happen. And this is like it happening, so it's very exciting to be back in England and in Bath. And I'd like to thank Ian and Betty for asking me to give this talk. I've been itching to talk about Thomas De Quincey in Bath for about 25 years and didn't ever see a way that I was going to make that happen. So I'm very grateful to you for coming out. Thank you very much. And I'm very grateful to you people online for joining us. And I'm going to walk us through some of the interesting things, I hope, about De Quincey and about De Quincey in Bath. And then you can ask me questions about where De Quincey went to school, for example, and I will be able to tell you. So this is called the English Opium-Eater because, as Ian said, De Quincey is better known sometimes as the English Opium-Eater. More people know the name the English Opium-Eater than they know the name Thomas De Quincey, or that used to be the case. And dreaming and opium dreams and De Quincey's dreams are a part of what I'm going to talk about tonight. So I'm just going to plunge in and tell you as many interesting things as I can about Thomas De Quincey in the next hour, and then you can ask me questions. How's that? That seems reasonable. Right. Okay. So when I am at a talk, I like knowing how long I've got and how many sections it's in. So this is me telling you how this is going to go. I'm going to talk about Thomas De Quincey, and then I'm going to talk about De Quincey's, for me, really fascinating life in Bath, and then I'm going to talk about De Quincey's writings on Bath. Okay, so that's where we're going. So the first part, this is an engraving of De Quincey that I particularly like. The first part, I'm going to just tell you a little bit about Thomas De Quincey. He was born in Manchester in 1785. He was educated at Oxford, and he didn't get an Oxford degree. He bolted halfway through. I'm always interested in people that go to school but they don't finish. Quincey didn't finish. He did brilliantly on the exams, but for a variety of reasons, he bolted and didn't finish. He went to the English Lake District, where he lived for many years. He worshipped the poet William Wordsworth and the poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and I'll talk a lot about that in the next little while. And De Quincey died in Edinburgh in 1859. So despite all that opium, he lived a good long while. He wrote for the leading magazines of the day on an incredible range of topics, from science, theology, crime, and philosophy, and economics, to works of satire and fiction and aesthetics. So he's best known for writing about opium and writing about himself, but he has a lot to say about crime or philosophy or economics as well. As a literary critic, De Quincey is known for a couple of things, but one of the best known is his distinction between the literature of knowledge and what he calls the literature of power. Now, De Quincey took this as he took many things, and he said he took it. Sometimes De Quincey said, yeah, I nicked it, and sometimes he didn't say. In this instance, he did say, I got this from Wordsworth, and I got it kind of from Coleridge. De Quincey's debts to Wordsworth and Coleridge are very large, and his distinction between the literature of knowledge and literature of power is one of them. The image I've chosen here, there is first the literature of knowledge and second the literature of power. And one of the reasons that I really like this definition is it tells people who are majoring in English when I'm lecturing to them why it is that you would want to study poetry anyway. What good would that do if you understood a poem better at the end of the hour than you did at the beginning of the hour? What good is that going to do you? And De Quincey talking about the literature of power, what power is, according to De Quincey, I think is one way of thinking about it. So I've quoted De Quincey here because I love quoting Thomas De Quincey. What do you learn from a cookery book? This is De Quincey talking about literature of knowledge and literature of power, and he's trying to distinguish between the two. And this is a very characteristic way of De Quincey talking about it. What do you learn from a cookery book? Something new, something that you did not know before in every paragraph. But would you therefore put the wretched cookery book on a higher level of estimation than the divine poem? And the poem he's talking about is John Milton's Paradise Lost, which is for De Quincey an example, the preeminent example of the literature of power. So he says, well, there's a cookbook and there's Paradise Lost. What do you learn from a cookbook? Lots of new things. What do you learn from Paradise Lost? Nothing. But would you therefore say that Paradise Lost is not as important? So you can see. So this is what De Quincey says in explanation. So why would we put Paradise Lost above the wretched cookery book? And this is De Quincey's answer, very memorable answer, I think. What you owe to Milton, to Paradise Lost, to a poet who produces the literature of power, what you owe is not any knowledge, of which 1,000,000 separate items are still but 1,000,000 of advancing steps on the same earthly level. What you owe is power, that is, exercise and expansion to your own latent capacity of sympathy with the infinite, where every pulse and each separate influx is a step upward, a step ascending as upon a Jacob's ladder from earth to the mysterious altitudes above the earth. So for De Quincey, the literature of power moves us, enlightens us, expands our capacities for sympathy. And a cookery book doesn't do that. So for De Quincey, and for people, I think, who teach English literature, that's important. Okay, so as a literary critic, we know De Quincey because of things like the literature of knowledge and the literature of power. As a biographer, De Quincey wrote indiscreet accounts of his relationship with the poet Somerset of Coleridge, that's Coleridge, of course, on the top, and with William Wordsworth. And you'll hear me say more than once, you've already heard me say, that De Quincey's relationship with these two intellects has a profound impact on what he produces. He gets to know both of them well, and when he gets particularly skint, particularly hard up for money, Coleridge dies in July 1834, and De Quincey writes a 4-part essay on Coleridge for September, October, November, and January 1835, in which he talks about his relationship with Coleridge. And by the standards of the day, he is terribly indiscreet. And then 5 years later, he writes about Wordsworth, a 5-part series of articles on Wordsworth, not necessarily about his poetry, but about his life. And Wordsworth, as we'll see in a minute, is outraged. De Quincey sits by his fire and listens to sort of private family talk, and then goes up to Edinburgh and writes articles about it. And people, especially people who are being written about, I mean, that wouldn't be particularly pleasant now, but in the 1830s, it was considered utterly scandalous. And Coleridge's Coleridge passed away, of course, but Coleridge's family was very upset, and Wordsworth was very upset. So Robert Southey, this picture of Southey, the poet laureate, was furious with the De Quincey articles about Coleridge. And Southey told Coleridge's son Hartley that he ought to take a strong cudgel, proceed straight to Edinburgh, and give De Quincey publicly on the streets there a sound beating. So that's what Southey thought of what De Quincey had done, tittle-tattling on his friends. But of course, as we read them, they're absolutely fascinating to hear what Wordsworth thought about, morning tea, or that landscape, or any one of a number of different, a friend, his sister, etc. And De Quincey, in these essays, also say, writes at length about Dorothy Wordsworth. And he is the first critic to take her seriously as a writer. And what he says about Dorothy in these articles on the Wordsworths, more broadly speaking, is really fascinating and prescient I think. So Wordsworth himself did not read the articles. At least Wordsworth said he didn't read them. I'm not so sure he didn't read them, but Wordsworth said he didn't read them. But he see that what he heard, and this is what Wordsworth said when a friend, Henry Crabbe Robinson, told him about these articles that De Quincey had published in Tate's Edinburgh magazine in 1839. Wordsworth said, "A man who can set such an example, I hold to be one of the most worthless of mankind." So even Wordsworth, however, was partially mollified when a friend, this diarist Henry Crabbe Robinson, told him that De Quincey had described Wordsworth's wife Mary as a better wife than you deserve. And Wordsworth says, "Did he say that?" Wordsworth exclaimed in a tone of unusual vehemence. "Did he say that? That is so true that I can forgive him almost anything else he says." So there is an immediacy and even an urgency. And there's also, De Quincey had great hopes for his relationship, especially with Wordsworth, and it went sour. And there was a terrible sense of hurt in De Quincey's essays as well. And at the end, he concludes by saying, "Really, I know that I expected too much from my relationship with Wordsworth." But also, Wordsworth didn't respond to my enthusiasm for his poetry and support of his poetry and enthusiasm for his genius. Wordsworth didn't respond very kindly. So I expected too much, and so it failed for that reason. And also Wordsworth really could have given more. So De Quincey reaches sort of a mature perspective, I guess, by the end of his immediate relationship with Wordsworth. So in addition to biographies and literary critics, De Quincey also wrote 3 essays that he called On Murder, Considered as One of the Fine Arts. And these essays really are, they define a moment in the rise of crime and detective fiction. And they exerted a remarkable influence on the work of people like Edgar Allan Poe. These are all people who followed De Quincey: Edgar Allan Poe, Wilkie Collins, Charles Dickens, Arthur Conan Doyle, a whole bunch of other people. So the rise of crime and detective fiction is, I think, pretty thoroughly imbricated in De Quincey's 3 essays, which, as you can see, first one was 1827, then 1839, and then 1854. So this is a subject De Quincey keeps coming back to. And the subject of these essays is a series of murders that happened in December 1811. They were committed, we think, by a man named John Williams, who broke into a house on the Radcliffe Highway in London and killed all 4 inhabitants in a very vicious way. And then 12 days later, we think, he broke into another house and murdered 3 of the 5 inhabitants. And De Quincey cannot stop thinking about these essays, the Radcliffe Highway murders, and the man that, well, the latest scholarship says it wasn't him at all. But John Williams is in the Dictionary of National Biography because of De Quincey's essays. What De Quincey turns this crime into, we're used to real crime, true crime reporting. But true crime and narratives that deal with true crime, that begins, or at least is bolstered by De Quincey's interest in the Radcliffe Highway murders. So one of the contemporary writers who's most fascinated by these murders is Peter Ackroyd. And in a book called Dan Leno and the Limehouse Golem, he writes this. May I quote Thomas? This is very early on in the text. So if you're a Thomas De Quincey fan, you pick up a book and someone says, "May I quote Thomas De Quincey?" You know you're in the right book. This is interesting. May I quote Thomas De Quincey? Ask the murderer politely. In Peter Ackroyd's Dan Leno and the Limehouse Golem. In the pages of his essay, On Murder Considered One of the Fine Arts, I first learned of the Radcliffe Highway deaths. And ever since that time, his work, De Quincey's work, has been a source of perpetual delight and astonishment to me. And we spend most of this narrative inside the head of the murderer. And this murderer is constantly referring to De Quincey's essays on murder considered as one of the fine arts. And there are other people. At Bath Spa, I teach a contemporary crime writer named Val McDermott. And Val McDermott is fascinated by Thomas De Quincey. So, murder in De Quincey's hands. This is this comment is based on an insight by a theorist named Foucault. And Foucault, in a book called Discipline and Punish, cites De Quincey as one of the people who sort of rewrites the history of crime and does it in a way that we're very, very, very familiar with. And he does it by aestheticizing and making crime sort of an intellectual puzzle that we're going to solve. And so detection and the rise of crime fiction, Foucault says, comes via writers like De Quincey. So murder in De Quincey's hands became a subject that could be detached from social circumstances and then ironized and tamed and analyzed and vividly consumed by a mass magazine audience. So looked at through this lens, criminals were poets. W.H. Auden says murder is negative creation. That is, I redo the world, only you're not in it. That's Auden's notion of what is fascinating about crime fiction. Criminals were poets, violence was entertainment, assassinations were intellectual puzzles, aesthetics trumped ethics, and style was far more important than substance. So, for example, Oscar Wilde in Le Décadence at the end of the 19th century, Oscar Wilde was fascinated by De Quincey because it's all about style and not about substance. So if we said to Thomas De Quincey now, oh, by the way, John Williams didn't commit those murders, I think De Quincey would go, well, that doesn't make any difference at all. It's what De Quincey created on the page. So those are some of the areas that De Quincey has attracted attention. 200 years ago this year, as Ian already very kindly said, De Quincey produced a book called Confessions of an English Opium-Eater, which is very broadly considered the first modern drug memoir. So we're very used to drug memoirs now as they flood out. But the first one it's not just me. Like sometimes I have to say to my students, yes, I really like them, but that doesn't mean I'm exaggerating. It is broadly considered the first drug memoir. In Confessions, De Quincey reconceived the confessional genre and transformed our perception of drugs in ways that continue to inform current debates. So one of the reasons that I'm here in Bath and at Bath Spa University working on De Quincey is because I really believe that what De Quincey constructed around drug addiction, what De Quincey has convinced us that drug addiction means, and what I think is a more constructive way of thinking of it, are two very different things. De Quincey there are lots of people say De Quincey invented addiction, that people get addicted to opium via the lens of De Quincey, even if they've never heard of him. They think that opium, for example, has to do with creativity. Well, pharmacologically speaking, the evidence is it doesn't really do very much for you. But De Quincey's got, all these writers convinced that creativity and opium, heroin, go together. And part of my research is to try to get to the bottom of what De Quincey constructed and what is pharmacologically definable. So Confessions of English Opium-Eater is the work that he's best known for. And in this work, he initiated the tradition of the modern artist. My example is always Keith Richards. And I think I need to come up with another example, but he's my best example. Initiated tradition of the modern artist's exile and prophet. De Quincey not only invented recreational drug taking, that is, before we got to De Quincey, people didn't say, well, I'm going to swallow this drug and go out to the opera. Whereas after De Quincey, people thought, oh, that'd be so cool. Maybe I'm going to do that. And I know it seems, but before, opium is a medicine. Opium is what you take to put you to sleep. Opium is in your medicine cabinet. Kant says it's in the medicine cabinet. And by the time we get to Nietzsche in 1871, it's in the popular bloodstream. And the question is, well, how did it go from being very largely considered as a medicine, as aspirin, to something that is in popular culture? And my very short answer is Thomas De Quincey, Confessions of an English Opium-Eater, 1821. De Quincey not only invented recreational drug taking, but he also put in place two other formidable narratives of drug experience. The first of those is the inexorable decline and collapse of the addict. And then the third narrative, so there's the euphoria of the drug experience, the inevitable decline of the addict, and then that other, even more pathos-ridden narrative called kicking the habit. So the literature of addiction is often broadly defined in three categories: the celebration of the drug, the horrors of addiction, and then the even more pathos-ridden narrative of, okay, I don't want to be an addict anymore. How do I get out? And very often in literature of addiction, the answer is the person, of course, as we know, doesn't get out. So I think Sedgwick is right. She's a brilliant critic, Sedgwick. I think she is right to say it's an even more pathos-ridden narrative. So this is W.S. Burroughs, who is arguably the most famous opiate addict of the 20th century, talking about De Quincey. Now, when I first got to Burroughs, I thought, oh, he's going to trash De Quincey. He's not going to like De Quincey. But Burroughs writes wonderfully about De Quincey. And he says De Quincey wrote the first, this is 1981, he says De Quincey wrote the first and still the best book about drug addiction. And I think the reason Burroughs praises De Quincey is because Confessions of an English Opium-Eater takes in all three categories. That is, it describes what De Quincey feels this intense euphoria of taking the drug, and very memorably described. And then he describes the horrors of addiction, and then he describes trying to get off opium. And so I think one of the reasons Burroughs praises him is because there is this survey of the three central aspects of drug addiction. So De Quincey recorded his intense opium dreams in Confessions, and also in other drug-related works such as Suspiria de Profundis, which is 1845, and The English Mail Coach. And in all three of these works, De Quincey describes the very lurid dreams that he has. And some of them might be inspired by opium, some of them might be inspired by the lack of opium. But De Quincey is very proud of the prose that he's got to deploy to describe addiction. And he says in 1853, I desire to remind him, that is to remind the reader, I desire to remind the reader of the perilous difficulty besieging all attempts to clothe in words the visionary scenes derived from the world of dreams, where a single false note, a single word in a wrong key ruins the whole music. So De Quincey's attempts to describe his opium dreams, they're orchestral in the sense that he pulls out all the stops of the English language to try to render what happens in these opium dreams. And they are, some people find them like way over the top, and I don't find them that way at all. I think they are superb pieces of prose, and that they deploy the resources of the English language in a marvelous way. Tennyson said De Quincey didn't write poetry, but he wrote prose as fine as any poetry, which is sort of like on the way to poetry, sure. So now I'm going to talk about De Quincey's life in Bath. Okay? Seems reasonable. Right. So this is De Quincey's life in Bath. So De Quincey lived here in Bath from 1796 until 1799. So he's only here for 3 years, 3 teenage years. De Quincey arrives when he's 11, he removes when he leaves when he's 14, 15. It's a neglected period of his life, to be sure, and it's one that I hope I can convince you in the next several minutes deserves to be better known. So De Quincey left vivid accounts of his time here. He explored the city and its environs with great enthusiasm. Bath was the site of some of his most formative experiences, and his imaginative engagement with the city lasted for the rest of his life. So over and over and over again, De Quincey goes back to his time in this place. So the family first lived. De Quincey is born in Manchester, and he lives in Manchester till he's 11 years old. And then his father dies in 1792, and his mother, who is looking to climb the social ladder, says, well, we can't really do that in Manchester. Where can we go that's a little bit more upmarket? And she decides that they should go to Bath. So the family first lived at 11 North Parade. And one of the tasks I've set myself during my time in Bath is to get a plaque up. My friend, Professor Strachan, and I are going to get a plaque up, like somewhere in this city, to acknowledge that De Quincey was here. So the family first lived at 11 North Parade. The previous person in that house was the great Anglo-Irish statesman Edmund Burke. And De Quincey later remembered that when they moved into 11 North Parade, that state of Burke's health, connected with the expectation of still finding them there, brought for some weeks crowds of inquirers. So De Quincey, as a little 11-year-old boy, would go to the door and there'd be all these people saying, can we see Mr. Burke, please? And De Quincey, among other things, says, this really gave me a taste for the fact that like people might want to call around and see you if you became a writer. And De Quincey was quite sort of energized by the notion that that literary work could bring some kind of celebrity or fame. So Edmund Burke moves out, and the Quincey family moves in. I'm going to just say, just as a digression that I can't help, when the Quinceys move from Manchester, the person who buys their house, Greenhays, is a man named Robert Owen, who's the industrialist, and yes, who's very, very important. He moves into the Manchester house. So Robert Owen moves in, and De Quincey gets down here, and Edmund Burke moves out. It's quite remarkable. So De Quincey wrote dozens of political essays deeply indebted. De Quincey's politics line up very tightly with Burke's, deeply indebted to Burke's ideas and rhetoric. And this is what De Quincey says in 1827 about Edmund Burke. All hail to Edmund Burke, the supreme writer of his century, that is the 18th century, the man of the largest and finest understanding. So De Quincey's enthusiasm for Burke, especially as a prose writer, De Quincey writes a little bit of poetry. It's really not very good. It's really not very good. It's like, for me, it's like reading Wordsworth's prose. It's really not, I got to read it out loud. I stumble with Wordsworth's prose, but I will always love Wordsworth. Right? So I sometimes say to my students, just because you can write a good play doesn't mean you can write a good novel. There are different talents necessary. So De Quincey writes a series of essays on the Second French Revolution of 1830, and they are very closely modeled on Burke's attack on the French Revolution in 1789, in a book we're all familiar with, Reflections on the Revolution in France. And De Quincey writes a kind of reflections on the Second Revolution in France in a series of Blackwood's essays in 1830. So what else happened in Bath? De Quincey was born, I find this really fascinating, De Quincey was born Thomas Quincy. He was not born De Quincey. He was born Tom Quincy. And shortly after arriving in Bath, Mrs. Quincy, I wrote De Quincey's biography, this is a real pain, trying to keep track when the mother doesn't have the same name as the son. Shortly after arriving in Bath, Mrs. Quincy changed the surname to the more genteel De Quincey. So when they moved into 11 North Parade, the Quincy family lived there. Then a short while afterward, the De Quincys lived there. One of the main reasons she chose the city of Bath was the many opportunities it provided for her and her children to move in more refined social circles. And her adoption of the prefix de was undoubtedly an attempt to smooth the way. But her close friend, Hannah More, shown here, persuaded her quite soon afterwards to change it back to Quincy, that it was far too worldly and aspiring. And so that's the name that you were given when you were born, that's the name you should keep. So Mrs. De Quincey went back quite shortly afterward to Quincy. And we learn a lot about De Quincey when at one point she must have come home and said, Thomas De Quincey, we're not going to do that anymore, it's going to be Thomas Quincy. And De Quincey looked at her, presumably, and said, well, I'm not changing it, I like it. And so Mrs. Quincy had a son, Mr. De Quincey. De Quincey defied, at this stage, De Quincey defied everything his mother said. He was a superb teenager. He would go along with nothing. De Quincey defied his mother and retained what he later called the aristocratic de. He was fascinated with persona and with the ways in which his own identity might be extended or subverted or invented. And when we talk about him inventing addiction, he invented this persona. So he assigned his name for the rest of his life, Thomas De Quincey. Although I have to tell you, having looked at many hundred De Quincey manuscripts, sometimes it's a small d and sometimes it's a capital D. And it drives me nuts, this inconsistency. But I can't really get upset about it because it's De Quincey's inconsistency, even though I get upset about it. So at Bath, what do we know De Quincey read? He read John Milton's Paradise Lost, which we've already talked about, The Literature of Power, and William Jones's Asiatic Researches, Samuel Ogden's Sermons. His mother's religious opinions are very near Hannah More's. Henry Venn's A Complete Duty of Man, Samuel Johnson's The Rambler, Goldsmith's History of England, and many other texts. The teenage De Quincey, he's 11 when he arrives, but he's 13, 14 toward the end. De Quincey, we know, went dancing in Bath. It's hard to imagine a 14-year-old De Quincey dancing in Bath, but that's what happened, and he's happy about it. He talks about it in his letters. He drank wine. That's not hard to imagine. He socialized in the pump room and took in concerts in the upper rooms. He was acquainted with several leading families among Bath's large French immigrant community. This is, of course, the French Revolution is going on. War is going on. The French Revolution from 1789 to, in one conception, 1815. De Quincey met the British naval officer Sir Sidney Smith, shown here, who was educated in Bath and who had recently escaped from a French prison. And it's not clear how De Quincey got to know Smith, but he recounts going with Smith to the pump room, where Smith had all these observers flocking to him, and where De Quincey shielded him from the embarrassing, or De Quincey says he shielded him from the embarrassing curiosity of many admirers. So now I want to move to De Quincey, what De Quincey wrote about Bath. So, the collected letters of Thomas De Quincey. As Ian has already said, my main research project here is to produce, for the first time, a collected edition of De Quincey's letters. And this is a project that is getting bigger by the day because I keep finding letters. When I began looking for letters 2 years ago, I thought, boy, I really hope I find letters. And now I get up every day and I say, boy, I really hope I don't. I don't find any letters because the project's going like this. But of course, what is immensely exciting and fascinating is I read a letter that De Quincey wrote to his daughter in 1854 that I don't think anybody's looked at since Florence received that letter in 1854. And when it tells us something, tells me something about De Quincey that I didn't know, and I think, well, I'm going to edit this and publish this, our conception of what De Quincey did, who he was, who he knew, what he wrote, why he wrote, all those things are going to change. And, you know, for a literary scholar, that's a pretty exciting proposition. So most of the letters are here in Britain, as you would, well, as I would hope. They're at Dove Cottage in the Lake District. They're at the National Library of Scotland, where De Quincey, he lived in Edinburgh from roughly 1829 to 1859. He's buried. The Castle Rock is here. De Quincey's down here, St. Cuthbert's Churchyard. You don't have to go there, but it's quite exciting to see. Well, quite exciting for me. Quite exciting for me to see De Quincey's grave. And in London, they're in the British Library. So this is not a letter. This is not the letter I'm going to talk about. But this, I thought it might be interesting to see De Quincey's hand. There is a real difference between Thomas De Quincey sober and writing a letter and Thomas De Quincey not sober and writing a letter. And if you're me, you just hope that when a new letter turns up, it's De Quincey in a stable period, not De Quincey in an unstable, stressed out, washed out, strung out period, because he starts using abbreviations and his hand is very wobbly. So it's very difficult to predict how long it takes to, how long it takes to transcribe a letter. Well, how long is a piece of string? Right? It depends on what state he was in when he wrote it. When he's young, it's pretty straightforward. When that's before opium hits, it's pretty straightforward. And then when opium and poverty hit, then it can get. So this is June 3rd, 1824, and he's writing from Liverpool. And you can see his hand is, it's pretty discernible. You can make your way through that. So the first letter that De Quincey writes is written in Bath. And it's to his sister Mary, who is staying with friends in Bristol. So when I get this edition done, the first thing you will see is Thomas De Quincey, 13 years old, in Bath. This is dated March 12, 1799. And Thomas tells Mary that he was introduced last Thursday night to young Lord Westport, Lord Altamont's only child. And Westport and Altamont feature in Confessions. And on Sunday, I dined with him at his house at Lansdowne. He is a very nice boy, about my size. Now, De Quincey was, when a full-grown man, under 5 feet. He swallowed a lot of opium for a guy under 5 feet. And and he's, of course, very, very conscious of his height. And so I think this is quite revealing. He writes to his sister and he said, Westport's a nice boy, he's about my size. So there's a possibility of friendship. And then he signs the letter, "Believe me, your affectionate sister, Tabitha Quincey." Now, what's going on there? He doesn't sign it Tabitha De Quincey like we might expect, and he doesn't sign it Thomas Quincy as we maybe might expect. He signs it Tabitha Quincey, your affectionate sister, Tabitha Quincey. So I won't digress into what I think all of that means. But it does signal, again, De Quincey's interest in persona, the creation of identity, perhaps the desire to be someone other than he is, play acting, and so on. De Quincey does not stay close to his sister, Mary. De Quincey wrote his second excellent letter from Wingfield, or Winkfield as it was then. It's 1799. It's also addressed to Mary, but he's in Wiltshire now. And he says to Mary, "We'll be in Bath by 11 o'clock. I believe Miss Spencer is coming with us to Bath, and Miss Christiana. Miss Betsy and Amy are at Oxford." De Quincey signs his second letter, my dear, believe me, your ever dutiful son and affectionate sister, Tabitha Quincey. Okay, so I will not go down that path, but his playfulness with identity and, in fact, with gender is really quite striking. And you can see De Quincey lives for many, many years in dire poverty. And it's quite something to read the letters from Bath, where he's clearly traveling in affluent circles and going to Lord Altamont's house. And so there is a very precipitous decline in De Quincey's social circumstances, to a considerable extent brought on by De Quincey himself. And I would say to a considerable extent willingly brought on by De Quincey himself. De Quincey looks back when he was a little boy in Bath, and he says, I had a perfect craze for being despised. And there's a lot of Thomas De Quincey in that expression. So, Dreams of Somerset. This is The Labyrinth by Holborn, by the Holborn Museum. And I've been in Bath now. I was here I always do that. I was here in 1819. No, I wasn't. I just live in 1819. I was here in 2019. And my wife Carol and I went to this labyrinth and stood at this labyrinth. And as many of you probably know, it's not there. The ground is there, of course, and the desire to build the maze again is on a little plaque. And you know, I know Jane Austen was here. I know Wentworth wrote the letter in the White Hart Hotel. But for me, standing there and looking at this maze and thinking, this boy, Thomas De Quincey, came and was 11 years old. He got lost in that maze, and it became a metaphor for him for all kinds of experience, including his experience with drugs. So De Quincey says, we have all been in labyrinths of debt, labyrinths of error, labyrinths of metaphysical nonsense. But I speak of literal labyrinths. Now at Bath, in my labyrinthine childhood, there was such a mystery. This mystery I used to visit, and he used to go. And so there's many, if you study English literature, there are many moving areas in Bath where you can go and stand. For me, standing and looking at this maze and knowing what was coming for that boy was a very moving experience. And 1853, De Quincey writes a book called Autobiographical Sketches. And he says, standing and playing in that maze at Bath, looking back, you know, more than half a century. And I can assert that no type ever flashed upon my mind so pathetically shadowing out the fatal irretrievability of early errors in life. Turn but wrong at first entering the thicket, and all was over. You were ruined. No wandering could recover the right path. And for me, that's De Quincey speaking about drug addiction. That's De Quincey saying, well, it was a medicine, I took it for medicine, then it ensnared me, and I could never get out. I could never escape that addiction. So that happened. When I say some of the most formative experiences in De Quincey's life happened in Bath, playing in that maze created a metaphor that stayed with him for his whole life. De Quincey attended Bath Grammar School from 1796 to 1799. I have walked home through Bath several times with my friend John, and he's always trying not to go by Bath Grammar School. And I say, well, we can't walk home without going. So poor John has to come all around the circuitous route to walk by Bath Grammar School. The Reverend Nathaniel Morgan was the headmaster during De Quincey's time there, and De Quincey remembers him in Confessions as a ripe and good scholar, and more importantly, of all my tutors, the only one whom I loved or reverenced. De Quincey was an immensely gifted classicist, and he was very aware of how much smarter he was than the people who were teaching him. And he was arrogant enough to think, well, why the hell should I even go to class? I know more than they do. The only one who isn't in that category is the Reverend Nathaniel Morgan at Bath Grammar School, which De Quincey loved. It's the only school that De Quincey valued. So there's a very famous moment in Confessions, or at least famous if you study De Quincey. Morgan was very impressed when this 11-year-old boy arrived. Morgan was very impressed with his skills as a classicist. This is a quotation from Confessions of an English Opium-Eater. That boy, said Morgan, pointing the attention of a stranger to me, that boy could harangue an Athenian mob better than you or I could address an English one. That's how gifted a classicist De Quincey was at 11 years old. He could harangue an Athenian. He could do better in ancient Greece than you and I could do today. And because Morgan was a scholar of some reputation, I think it's possible to credit that assertion. In his career with the magazines, De Quincey wrote dozens of articles on classical literature, on history, on philosophy, and he very often credited Morgan at Bath Grammar School with greatly enhancing his knowledge in all these areas. This is a De Quincey manuscript of an essay, and you can see that it's a little bit harder going as he starts crossing things out and abbreviating things and writing up the margin and underlining and parenthetical asides and all the rest of the instructions he gives. He gives instructions that are, of course, meant to be helpful, but all they do is get your head spinning. It was also at Bath, if that were not all enough, it was also at Bath that De Quincey first encountered the lyrical ballads of Wordsworth and Coleridge, published, of course, in 1798. And it's very difficult to overstate the impact of this collection on De Quincey. But what's also difficult to overstate is the fact that Wordsworth and Coleridge were jeered for the first 30 years of their poetic career. De Quincey read them when he was 14 years old and went, Wordsworth is the most important poet since John Milton. Milton's Paradise Lost is 1666, 1667. It's one of those two. Which one is it? 67? 67. 1667. So there's a century and a half there. De Quincey reads lyrical ballads and goes, right, we've got the next John Milton. While the rest of the scholarly community, or very largely the scholarly community, is deriding Wordsworth ferociously and deriding Coleridge, De Quincey says, I know he's the greatest. Now, I don't know what you were doing at 14 years old, but I can tell you that I was not reading contemporary poetry and going, oh, this is very good. Or this, that's way. That is not what I was doing at 14. So the impact of the lyrical ballads, De Quincey, in 1803, De Quincey writes what can only be described as 17 years old. He writes a fan letter to Wordsworth. And essentially he says, I read your poetry. I know what an immensely important and powerful poet you are. And if I could ever sort of drop by Grasmere, say hello, that would be great. And Wordsworth very generously writes back and says that will be fine. So De Quincey goes to Liverpool and then walks up to Grasmere, gets within sight of Wordsworth's cottage and goes, I can't do it. I'm too nervous. I'm too frightened. Even though Wordsworth has invited him and said, do drop by, De Quincey can't go up to it or not, because he's too in awe of this spectacular genius of Wordsworth. So that's 1805. So he goes back. Next summer, gets off Oxford, goes to Liverpool, walks to Grasmere, stands on Hammerscar again. Can't do it. Can't work up the courage to go say, hello, Mr. Wordsworth, you're the greatest poet since John Milton. So he goes back. And in 1807, he finally screws up the courage and meets Wordsworth and Coleridge. In 1804, before he's met Wordsworth, he says, at Bath, I was shown the poem of We Are Seven, which was handed about in manuscript. That's what De Quincey tells Wordsworth in 1804, because Wordsworth is sort of curious as to how De Quincey has found him. And it is, to me, just an amazing thought to think there was a manuscript of We Are Seven circulating around Bath, and that this 14-year-old schoolboy saw it, read it, and went, who on earth wrote this? And where do I get a copy of the volume? And we don't know exactly how De Quincey tracked it all down, but we do know that the impact was enormous. De Quincey's dreams of personal, intellectual, and literary relationship with both poets began in Bath. That is, with Coleridge and with Wordsworth, began in Bath. Lyrical ballads, of course, you know, is a combination of both Coleridge's poems and Wordsworth's poems. It begins with The Round of the Ancient Mariner, which is Coleridge's, and it ends with Tintern Abbey, which is, of course, Wordsworth's. So De Quincey finds out who wrote these poems. In 1803, he's in Liverpool, and he writes, I'm still thinking of Coleridge. De Quincey wrote in 1803. And then he links Coleridge, The Ancient Mariner, and Bath. Coleridge strikes me, as I believe he always did, with a resemblance to my mysterious character. And De Quincey says, my mysterious character is a compound of the Ancient Mariner and the Bath concert room traveler with bushy hair. Now, who's the bathroom? I don't know. I don't know who that is. Would I like to know? Yes, I would very much like to know. And I can't figure it out who it is. I begin to think him, Coleridge, the greatest man that has ever appeared, and go to sleep. That's De Quincey at 17 years old. De Quincey wrote at length about Coleridge in the biographical essays I mentioned earlier in this 4-part series for Tate's Magazine. And this series begins with De Quincey saying, "The reading of The Ancient Mariner was the greatest event in the unfolding of my own mind." And I always say to my students, how can a poem, The Ancient Mariner, be the greatest event in the unfolding of someone's mind? How does poetry work that it could do that? And I try to get them to think about how a poem, and this is sort of, like a supernatural Gothic, shoots a bird, goes to the, how is that the greatest event in the unfolding of De Quincey's own mind? So it's only a matter of time before I get to Jane Austen. I've now reached Jane Austen. How you are thinking, can Morrison put Jane Austen and Thomas De Quincey together? Can it be done? I'm not sure, but I'm going to try right now. I think there's a possibility. So this, of course, is Jane Austen. This is Jane Austen. The only portrait we have that we think is her, drawn by her sister Cassandra, about 1811. And the other half of the reason I came to Bath was to study and talk about Jane Austen. So according to Austen's sister Cassandra, the novel that eventually became Northanger Abbey was written in 1798-99. So this is the exact time when De Quincey is living in the city. At this time, De Quincey was a resident in the city. And of course, Catherine Morland, this is a quotation that'll be familiar to many of you. "Here are a variety of amusements, a variety of things to be seen and done. Oh, who can ever be tired of Bath?" cries the heroine of Northanger Abbey, Catherine Morland. And she is a teenager in Bath in 1798-99, as is De Quincey. And De Quincey De Quincey enjoyed many of the same activities that Catherine Morland did, such as socializing in the pump room. So both were living in Bath, I have been able to determine. Both were living in Bath in the summer of 1799. So that's quite an image. I think Jane Austen's here and Thomas De Quincey's just down the street. By this point, De Quincey and his family had moved to 6 Green Park Buildings East. This is Queen Square, the picture where we are now. So they left North Parade at some point. I don't know what it was, but I'm not leaving the city till I find out when they moved from 11 North Parade to 6 Green Park Buildings East. The De Quincey's left the family left in 1801. De Quincey left in 1800. 6 years later, the Austens also lived in Green Park Buildings East, and Mr. Austen died a few doors down from where the De Quinceys had been living at 3 Green Park Buildings East. More intriguingly, I think, in August 1799, Jane Austen's aunt, Jane Perrot, was shopping in Bath and entered a haberdasher's shop in Bath Street known as Smith's. Later, the shop owner accused Austen's aunt of stealing a piece of lace that he had in fact planted in her parcel. Mrs. Perrot, Austen's aunt, and her husband were arrested and imprisoned. And if you've read Jane Austen's biography or Jane Austen's letters, you know that this was a pretty serious event when Austen's aunt is in prison. Aunt and uncle were arrested and imprisoned. At trial, Austen's aunt and uncle were acquitted, and the perfidy of the shop owner was exposed. So it came right in the end, but there was anxious moments in the Austen family as these people sat in prison. Now, like Austen and Northanger Abbey and Persuasion, those are there's 6 published Austen novels. 2 of them are set in Bath, Northanger Abbey, and Persuasion. Like Austen, Northanger Abbey, and Persuasion, De Quincey exploits the people and places of Bath in one of his finest pieces of fiction. The De Quincey's aims are very different than Austen's. De Quincey published a tale of terror called The Household Wreck in Blackwood's Edinburgh Magazine in 1838. And it is his nightmarish account of incarceration. It's a Gothic tale of terror of incarceration, injustice, sexual predation, and wronged innocence. Its central incident is clearly indebted to the arrest of Austen's aunt in Bath in 1799. So Austen doesn't know De Quincey, but it is, I think, a quite remarkable, striking fact. The discovery of this was made, I have to say, by a Canadian academic named W.J.B. Owen, who noticed that De Quincey's tale and Austen's account in her letters were strikingly similar. So I'm going to leave Jane Austen now with reluctance and move back to De Quincey more squarely. At the beginning of his 3rd year at Bath Grammar School, De Quincey was sent home for several weeks after one of his masters, a Mr. Collins, accidentally struck him in the head with a cane. Not quite sure how it happened, but he was trying to hit somebody else. He missed the student he was aiming at, and he thwacked De Quincey. One doctor thought that De Quincey had suffered a fractured skull. So Mr. Collins took a real good swing at this Bath Grammar School student in 1799, and De Quincey got sent home. And so De Quincey does not say that he used opium in Bath, but certainly the drug was used to treat headaches and an illness of the kind he describes. It's almost inconceivable that someone with a bad headache wouldn't get some kind of opiate. Opium was used to treat a headache as well as all manner of other ailments, including, and this list could go on for pages, it was used to treat everything because it makes you feel better. The problem is that when you stop taking it, then you get all sorts of aches and pains. And you go to the physician in Bath in 1789 or 1820, and you say, well, my knees hurt and I'm sweating a little bit. And then what does the physician say? Well, take some opium. And so you are putting out fire with gasoline. And on it goes. And so hundreds of thousands, millions of people around the world become addicted to opium. We don't have the notion of addiction until the beginning of the 20th century. Then it's just a question of will. If you didn't, you'd have the willpower to stop taking it. And so De Quincey doesn't say he used opium in Bath, but it's almost certain that he took some kind of opiate to deal with this headache. Opium, better known now in the form of one of its chief derivatives, heroin, was used by people of every class and age for self-medication in much the same way as aspirin is used today. It was cheap, it was legal, it could be purchased in a vast range of commercial cure-alls, and there are two of them here. You could make, then as now, you could make huge sums of money selling opiates. So De Quincey became addicted to opium in 1813. And so if you're trying to locate that, Austen publishes Pride and Prejudice in 1813. The Duke of Wellington is pushing forward with the British campaign of the Peninsular War, and De Quincey becomes addicted to opium. And so he first tries it in Oxford as a 19-year-old undergraduate in October 1804. He has this 9 years, he says, where he's got this sort of honeymoon experience with it. He says, I take it once every 3 weeks, and then it's okay. I've decided that I don't believe him. I don't believe that he could resist it for 3 weeks at a time. I think he was probably addicted to it before then, but of course I can't, unless I find a letter which says I can't stop drinking opium dated 1808, in which case I will go, aha. So in 1813, he says, I'm a regular and confirmed opium-eater, what we would today call an addict. And then when he tries to stop taking it, or when he takes too much of it, he has these lucid opium nightmares, in one of which he says, I was stared at, hooted at, grinned at, chattered at, by monkeys, by parakeets, by cockatoos. I was kissed with cancerous kisses by crocodiles. Coleridge, as I'm sure many of you know, was also an opium addict during these same years. De Quincey may have had his interest galvanized by the fact that his intellectual idol, Coleridge, also took opium. He wouldn't be the first person who read about a person they admired taking opium and then decided they were going to take opium. Coleridge says in 1814, the year of Mansfield Park, the horrors I have suffered from laudanum. Laudanum is opium dissolved in alcohol. So, so there's an argument to be made that De Quincey was not only addicted to an opiate, but he's also addicted to alcohol, because you're drinking gallons of it to get the opium in. So it is a fairly toxic combination. Coleridge says, the horrors I have suffered from laudanum, the degradation, the blighted utility, almost overwhelmed me. So though De Quincey is best known for his confessions, perhaps, I think, his finest essay is something called The English Mail Coach, which was published in 1849. So De Quincey is usually grouped with Wordsworth and Coleridge at the beginning of the 19th century, but some of the finest things he wrote are, after Jane Eyre. After Vanity Fair is 1847, English Mail Coach is 1849. So one of the things that I like to try to get my students to think about is the compartmentalization, calling him a romantic or calling him a Victorian, sometimes gets in the way, and it's maybe just better to think of him as a writer. And his career spanned a long time. So he published this essay on the English Mail Coach in 1849. And this essay has a great deal to do with Bath, and it's the essay that I'll conclude with. De Quincey opens the English Mail Coach with a reference to a man named John Palmer, who's the Bath-born theatre proprietor and postal reformer, who with William Pitt arranged the first mail coach trial run on the Bristol-Bath-London road. And Palmer was MP for Bath from 1801 until 1807. And that's where De Quincey begins this essay. But more importantly, in the English mail coach, De Quincey also meets the beautiful Fanny of the Bath Road. She's a young woman who stands on the road when the mail coach stops. Her grandfather's a driver. The mail coach stops, the horses change, and De Quincey has about 2 minutes to talk to the very beautiful Fanny of the Bath Road before he's got to get on the coach again. Fanny, he says, as the loveliest young woman for face and person that perhaps in my whole life I have beheld, merited the station which even yet, 35 years later, so we're talking now about 1814, published in 1849, so 35 years later is 1814, she holds in my dreams. And De Quincey's dreams are usually much closer to nightmares. And though by an accident of fanciful caprice, she brought along with her into those dreams a troop of dreadful creatures, fabulous and not fabulous, that were more abominable to a human heart than Fanny and the dawn were delightful. Her I could not willingly have spared. So his encounter with Fanny of the Bath Road produces these terrible nightmares. And De Quincey says, the nightmares are dreadful, but I could not have given up the chance of meeting Fanny. So in one of these dreams, or one of these nightmares, out of the darkness, if I happen to call up the image of Fanny from 35 years back, arises suddenly a rose in June. De Quincey's mind is intensely associative. And so Fanny is like a rose in June, so then he calls up an image of her and a rose in June comes up. Or if I think for an instant of a rose in June, up rises the heavenly face of Fanny. One after the other, like the antiphonies in a choral service, rises Fanny and the rose in June, then back again the rose in June and Fanny. And because it's De Quincey, we know we're tending toward darkness and some sort of Gothic ending. This dream ends with De Quincey saying, the dreamer finds housed within himself some horrid alien nature. And then De Quincey says, and how again, if not one alien nature, but two, but three, but four, but five, are introduced within what once he thought the inviolable sanctuary of himself. These, however, are horrors from the kingdom of anarchy and darkness. And De Quincey's opium dreams very often take us to the kingdoms of anarchy and darkness. From one vantage point, this nightmare, initiated by De Quincey's recollections of Fanny, the Bath Road, is a terrifying portrayal of a consciousness divided against itself in ways that clearly suggest schizophrenia. But I think even more disturbingly, from another, even more disturbing, for it suggests that there are parts within us. This is, I think of De Quincey the addict, of De Quincey consuming this foreign substance, that are not human but alien, and that in our worst nightmare, aspects of ourselves are inoculated upon these alien natures, inoculated upon the vile and the unthinkable. And this is when I think De Quincey is most penetrating and disturbing on what it's like to be addicted to a substance like an opiate. This is long before addictions, but De Quincey gives us this very horrifying image of the way in which the self fractures. And that fraction of the self, he associates for a variety of reasons with Bath and with Fanny of the Bath Road. So in 1800, the De Quincey family left, or let me say, the Quinceys were still in Bath, but De Quincey left. And he did not want to. His mother wanted to send him to his mother wanted to send him to Eton. And he didn't want to go to Eton. He wanted to stay in Bath. And he says to his mother, she ignores him, if then you let me go to any school, what can be better than the Bath one? He asked his mother in August 1800. The plan pursued there is in the plan pursued there, everyone allows to be incomparable. It is a very great improvement, I think, on the Eton method. So please, Mom, don't send me to Eton. I want to go to the Bath Grammar School, and I want to be near the Reverend Nathaniel Morgan. That didn't happen. He went to Manchester Grammar School. He bolted. He lived rough in the streets of London. He went to Oxford. He bolted, and he moved. So Quincy went to school, but he didn't always finish. Quincy's mother settled in Clifton, where he paid her frequent visits. Later, she moved back to Bath, where she died. She died in this city in 1846. And I think De Quincey visited her here more than we know now, but when I get the edition of the letters done, we'll know more accurately. De Quincey wrote, I think this is really interesting, wrote to the Bath Grammar School in 1853. So he is an older man now. That's De Quincey in 1853. And he writes to the Bath Grammar School. Doesn't write to Manchester, doesn't write to Oxford, but he writes to the Bath Grammar School. And he says, in mere justice and gratitude, I am bound to say, namely, that at Bath I learned every faction of such classical knowledge as I possessed in my youthful days. Now, that's not true. He learned a lot before he arrived in Bath from a private tutor, but it is an indication of the intellectual debt that De Quincey felt to Bath. So, De Quincey is most commonly associated with Manchester, where he was born, Oxford, where he went to school, London, where he set the Confessions, Lakes, where he moved to be near Wordsworth, or Edinburgh, where he spent the second half of his life. His time in Bath, I think, deserves, I hope I've maybe convinced you of some of that, deserves to be much better known. His 3 years here were deeply formative. His imaginative engagement with the city is evident across his career. Now, one of the things I have done recently is I have edited a selection of De Quincey's writings for Oxford University Press. And when you write Oxford University Press and say, I'm giving a talk at the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institute, they like that a lot. They're very pleased with that, as am I. And so they said, oh, right, well, let me give you a discount code. And then if you go on and order it, everybody there gets 30% off the book. So I said, well, can I stand up in front of people and say again? And I thought, yeah, I can do that. I can do that. So that's the discount code. And if you want to email me, I'll give you the discount code. And then you get 30% off the book. So if that's of any interest at all, I would hate you to pay full price. Don't edit that out, but I would hate you to pay full price. Okay, so that's it. Thank you very, very much. I hope that was of some interest. I'm going to go back to the slide that's got the discount code in case you feel tempted at some point. Thank you very, very much.
Yes. Thank you, Rob. We have time for questions. I see a raised hand back already. So I'm going to pass this round, but also for the benefit of people on Zoom, the question will be repeated by Rob.
Yeah, I'll look at the camera. I'll look at the camera and repeat your question. If I don't get it right, please yell at me.
I have to say, absolutely fascinating.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Brick aside, I can't imagine being able to school De Quincey as one of their pupils. But my question was really about the opium war and addiction.
Yes.
Because your comment that addiction wasn't really known until the end of the 19th century.
Yes, sir.
So, having looked at the opium movement of death, what challenge that?
Okay.
The Chinese commissioner in charge of Canton actually wrote to Queen Victoria and said, you must know harm and degradation which is caused to us in China. Would you permit this to happen in your own country?
Exactly right.
Of course, didn't deny. So I'm interested in how Quincy was regarded. Was he regarded as an obstinate writer and so on and so forth? But was there any view about his moral status? Is there any view about the fact that he encouraged people, I suppose, to take opiates, which, as we know, are damaging and degrading? What was people's attitude to this man who had the most extraordinary addiction and the great ability to publicize it?
Yes. Okay, so I'm going to look at the camera and say the question is, how was De Quincey regarded, both morally and as a writer who promoted quite enthusiastically the use of opiates? And I said that addiction wasn't really known until the end of the 19th century, and the gentleman pointed out that the Chinese people were writing to Queen Victoria to say, you must know the destruction this is doing. Have I got that right? Okay, so I'm going to say about Queen Victoria first, because you're absolutely right. What I intended to say, I mean, people in the ancient world were addicted to substances. It's just that we didn't call it addiction. We didn't know it as addiction. What I wanted to communicate was the physiological, medical, pharmacological understanding of addiction didn't exist until the beginning of the 20th century. But De Quincey was absolutely an addict, and the spreading of opium across China in a pretty aggressive, unpleasant way was making addicts of millions of Chinese people who suffered all the degradations that we now associate with addiction. So the point I was trying to make is that when I say addiction, and it applies to 1840, it's not right. It's inaccurate. You know, it's like calling someone homosexual in 1820 when we didn't have that word till the 1880s. So you get this, so I get caught. So you're absolutely right. There were loads of people, what we would call, I mean, De Quincey says in 1813, I became a regular and confirmed opium-eater. Right. So if you're a regular and confirmed opium-eater, today, that means you're an addict. So how was De Quincey regarded? Well, De Quincey had a very, very long career, you know, beginning with an adoration of Wordsworth in 1804, for example, or 1803 or 1799, and going way up to his death in 1859. When he began taking opium, it was seen as a weakness in character if you can't get rid of your opium habit. It wasn't called an addiction, it was called a habit. You might have a drinking habit, you might have an opium habit, and it was seen as a question of will. Right? Now, today, we don't see it, or at least that's not the only way of seeing it. For some people, for some specialists, addiction is a disease. It's not a question of will at all. Some people are more genetically disposed to addiction than other people. So when De Quincey began his career, it was much more common for people to take opium for everything under the sun. By the time you get toward the end of his career, he starts having to sort of recalibrate what he said about drugs because the climate is changing. And in 1868, so less than a decade after De Quincey's death, the British Parliament passes the Pharmacy Act. And the Pharmacy Act says exactly what you're saying, which is this is a problem. We've got to control the flow of this. And that leads, among other things, to all kinds of laws that come in toward the end of the 19th century and the 20th century. And it also, in different ways in America, leads to prohibition, leads to we're just getting rid of it all altogether. And so De Quincey is regarded as, like, when I wrote a biography of De Quincey it came out a decade or so ago, and one of the most negative reviews of the book, and I'm not going to cry, but it was like not very nice to me, and it was the reviewer was suggesting that I was celebrating opium and that in some way I wanted, you know, school children to use this or something. Probably wasn't that bad, but it seemed, reading it, it seemed that bad. That is to say that you know, discussing opium, discussing drug use was, you know, inherently bad. And so there were always some people who regarded De Quincey as sensational, seeking notoriety, and so on. But when he first wrote Confessions, taking opium was like saying I took aspirin. Nobody raised an eyebrow. It was in every medicine cabinet. Jane Austen's mom took it for travel sickness. Everybody had it. Just if anybody's got aspirin in their medicine cabinet today, that would be like having opium in your medicine. By the time we get to the end of De Quincey's career, that's changing. Part of the problem is that De Quincey is regarded as a real authority into the 20th century. He's regarded as a real authority. And when I sat down to write the biography and I spoke to people who know about opiate addiction, you know, some things have changed drastically. And the woman that I dealt with, a very, very, you know, wise, intelligent woman who's been studying opiates for a long time, said, there's a lot of things here that addicts tell me today about, like, for example, about constipation. Opium causes fierce constipation. And she said to me, there are some people that get off opium just because the pains of constipation are more ferocious than the withdrawal pains. So, like many things, the perception of De Quincey changed as perceptions and understandings of opium changed. I hope that answers everything. Does that answer everything? All right, good. Thank you very much. Wonderful question.
Yes, thank you very much for the talk. I suppose it's a similar sort of question, but flip the other way.
Okay.
I read Confessions for the first time leading up to this.
Good.
And it wasn't particularly thorough reading, so I think I might have missed some of the nuances. How much, one thing I kind of tried to work out was his own perception on his own addiction, or whichever word we were to use.
Yes.
So obviously when he's describing the effects of the opium, he describes it very vividly, and he is euphoric, etc. And obviously he describes the pains as in an equal and distressing amount of detail. But what do you think kind of the level of shame he carried for his own addiction, if indeed at all? Because I was kind of getting mixed messages from throughout, unless I missed a British Terrier bit where I think I'm a terrible person. But I missed that particular sentence.
So the question is, what level of shame do you think De Quincey felt about his addiction? I think that by the end of his career, he started to feel more conscious of what the substance was. But one of the quite sort of disarming things, especially, you know, when you're functioning and every morning you read the paper and it says, you know, there's a pandemic with COVID, and there's also in Canada, there's an opioid epidemic. And it's horrifying, you know, the age of kids, and not just kids, you know, but how it's perceived now is not how it was perceived then. And when De Quincey first celebrated it, it was absolutely fine. 1804, when he writes that, he doesn't write the passage, but when he describes his first, De Quincey says, "Oh heavens, what a revulsion, what an apocalypse of the world within me." He goes along to say, "This just blew my head off," and it was absolutely fantastic. And he celebrates it for 4 years. Now, when we get to the end, he rewrites Confessions in 1856. And what you sit down, you're exactly right. You sit down and think, okay, now what does he think? And De Quincey says, "I must have led a very sad life. It took away all kinds of things from me. I know that I lost relationships. I know that I lost friends. Da, 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 da. However, I sort of think if I hadn't taken it, I would have died a long time ago." And it really did give me energy to write when I didn't have energy. And it also gave me subject matter. You know, give me something to write about. You know, like people write about drugs now. But De Quincey's the first one to go, you know what? I think I make a living writing about drugs, about dreams, and all the rest of it. So the reason it's hard to get a hold of is because De Quincey is profoundly paradoxical on opium. There are all kinds of people, Jacques Derrida in particular, who say opium is the most profoundly paradoxical substance there is. You can't, it's the pharmacon, it's poison and cure, right? You take this, you feel better, and then it kills you. Right? So De Quincey at one point says, since leaving off, is one of my favorite sentences in all De Quincey, since leaving off opium, I take a great deal too much of it for my health. Right? And so does he feel shame? So he's making fun of it. So does he feel shame? Since leaving off opium, I take a great deal too much of it. Right? Well, so there's irony, and what level of shame he feels. When his daughter, Emily, doesn't have enough to eat in 1840, he writes this searing letter saying, you know, I bought opium, my children are hungry. So, you know, a letter like that, you get the full import, and you get a look at what his children grew up in. But, you know, then 3 days later, he's got his opium again, and he's feeling pretty good. And so it's very difficult to say. So my answer is, well, it's complicated. How's that? Yeah, right. That's probably not very satisfactory, but that is the closest I can get. Okay. Hi, Jane.
Hi.
Thank you.
I want to ask you about Tabitha De Quincey.
Oh, yes, ask him.
De Quincey was very young when he wrote that as his sister. How old was he?
He was 13.
13. Okay, so do you think that signing off was a self-conscious piece of literary posturing, as in tapping into the passion for writing verse pseudonymously as per the Della-Crescens and that call and response type poetry?
Yes.
Do you think he's just a young boy having a laugh? And does he ever continue? Does he sign himself thus further down the line?
No.
It's just a one-off.
It's just those two letters at the beginning that I know of so far. But of course, every time I get the letter, the first thing I do is go to the signature to see if when he's 19 he signed it down, or when he's, you know, older than that. I think Jen is probably, you know, a combination of all the things. He's highly literary, so, you know, parroting or having fun with Della-Crescen school would be something that he would be interested in doing. And I also think his own identity, I think he feels acutely conscious of his height and of his physical being. And I think he enjoys playing with, I think he learns at a very early age that you don't have to be who you are. You could invent this persona, like the English Opium-Eater. And then you get to be somebody else. And so play acting and language and a facility with language enables you to create other worlds. And for De Quincey, especially because death so often blighted his childhood, he loses 2 sisters and his father before he's 9. Creating other versions, other relationships within the family becomes, I think, a way of helping him see the world in a different way.
Was he assigning himself the English Opium-Eater, or was that just the name by which he was known?
I've seen over 800 De Quincey letters. I've never seen him sign himself the English Opium-Eater.
So he comes with the name Thomas De Quincey, that's behind him?
Yes. But it's like a small thing, but it keeps me awake at night. The capital D and the lowercase d, he's not consistent. It's like, I'm not going to let Morrison rest at all. I'm going to have a lowercase, right? So is it capital D? Or is it like French? And De Quincey is so, he's not enamored of as I need hardly say, not enamored of the French at all. And yet there he is, right? And he's profoundly English, and he lives half his life in Scotland. And that's like the tip of the iceberg. Right, so the creation of that pseudonym at the beginning, that he keeps. He's signing himself. He's arrested in Glasgow in 1842, and he signs himself T. Ellis Manners. Right, the certificate sends him to prison. Says, who is this? And he says T. Ellis Manners. Right, and the only time I've seen it is on the thing sending him to prison. So pseudonyms, that stays with him, but not Tabitha. And I've never seen him sign a letter to the English Opium-Eater. Articles he signs. Yeah. Yeah, thanks.
There's a few questions on the chat.
Oh, on the chat.
So let's run through a few. We've got 2 from Charles. One, I think, very straightforward one about it's a long way from Liverpool to Grasmere. Did he really walk?
Oh, I think so. Yeah, I mean, at one point I thought De Quincey walked, and then I found out later that he wants to meet Coleridge, and he's told Coleridge in the area, and so it's about 42 miles away. And I thought, okay, well, he just walked, but he didn't. He rented a horse and he rode. So it's possible. It is a long. It's possible that he took a horse to Coniston or something like that, or took a mail coach to Coniston. But he describes it as like a long, arduous journey. And it might be De Quincey just heightening the literary effect by saying, I walked from Liverpool to Grasmere. But so Charles might be absolutely right. De Quincey doesn't make it clear. He certainly walks from Coniston to Grasmere, but that's a much shorter walk.
And then this is quite a fun question, again from Charles. Who is the closest contemporary or nearly contemporary figure to De Quincey?
Contemporary now.
I believe that's what Charles said.
Will Self is very, very good. Is that the wrong answer? Will Self, I think. Will Self writes really sort of penetratingly on De Quincey as a former addict. And there are several moments in Will Self when he sort of, there's in De Quincey and in Will Self, there's this sort of consciousness, I don't know your name, but was suggesting, that there is a self-consciousness about this. And it's one of the most fascinating things about reading the literature of addiction is the sort of person that I want to be and the person that I've become.
Charles definitely approves of that.
Oh, does he? Oh, good. Good. Thank you, Charles. I'm looking right at you, Charles. That's very good. So the sense in which Will Self is sort of is an example of somebody who read De Quincey and Coleridge and said, well, if you want to become a great writer, you got to become addicted to heroin. And then he has this wonderful. It's in a book called Junk Mail. He has this wonderful moment where he says something like, "I was 21, thoroughly addicted to heroin, and not a very good writer." Right, so that's a problem, and so he backs out of heroin. But he's a prose writer. I have a lot of respect for Will Self. So Peter Ackroyd is another answer because he's so fascinated by De Quincey.
Charles
Oh, Truman Capote, the true crime, yeah, for sure, yeah. But what year is In Cold Blood? It's like 1966, you're telling me. Okay. Timothy Leary, that's a good, yeah, in terms of like a drug prophet, Yeah, and Timothy Leary, what's it called? I just found this out a little while ago. Timothy Leary's got a book called Confessions. What is it? It's Confessions of a Hope Fiend or something like that. Yeah, I have to say that I was in New York a few years ago before COVID, and I was with my my agent in New York, and we were talking about being in New York and things like that. And I started talking about De Quincey, and he said, "Oh, it sounds like Timothy Leary." And I said, "Well, he is a little bit like Timothy Leary." And then John said, "I was Timothy Leary's literary agent in the 1970s." And so that stopped anything I had to say. I've got nothing to say in my entire life, half that interesting. Oh, really? You knew Tim Leary, did you? When he went up to Montreal and sat with John in the bed there? Yoko, what was that like? So, yeah, so Timothy Leary is another excellent.
Actually, that leads us on to another question on the chat from our colleague, Chris Ivey.
Hi, Chris.
He said, recently I read a piece that described an emergent meaning of celebrity in the 19th century in terms of someone who was much talked about. You worked on celebrity in the period.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on De Quincey in relation to celebrity? Is it something that he sought or fostered? What's your reading?
Oh, that's an excellent question, Chris. Thank you very much. Well, it's commonly said the first literary celebrity is Byron, and that when Byron publishes Childe Harold's A Pilgrimage on March 3rd, 1812, he wakes up suddenly to find himself famous. And De Quincey's Confessions comes out only 9 years later. But Byron is a handsome, aristocratic man, and De Quincey is a whole bunch of wonderful things, but he's not that. And because he's in London, but he wants notoriety, and he certainly wants to sell copies of his work. He certainly wants to make money. So there's a certain way in which he is, I mean, I would say he's more a celebrity now in discussions of celebrity culture than he was then. He spent a lot of time living in the Lake District, where Wordsworth wrote The Recluse. It's hard to think of him as a celebrity in that way. And then he didn't move to London, he moved to Edinburgh. And not that there weren't celebrities there like Walter Scott, but I wouldn't say De Quincey did a very good job of cultivating that kind of star power. So De Quincey in 1854 writes something quite damning about Wordsworth in 1854 after Wordsworth dies. And there's a wonderful woman, Victorian writer named Harriet Martineau. And a friend writes and says, "I can't believe that De Quincey would say that." And Harriet Martineau writes back and says, "Well, it's only De Quincey. Nobody gives a damn what he says." So there is a sense in which he never occupies a central. I mean, when I started studying De Quincey, I was told flat out that that was a disastrous career decision. If I wanted to study an opium-addict who liked Wordsworth and read Kant, I should do Coleridge. Why on earth would I take a third-rate writer like De Quincey? And I thought, I don't know, maybe Coleridge just over my head. I don't know. But I thought I'll stay with De Quincey. And it looks a better decision now than it did when I made it. Like sometimes that happens, right? Sometimes it's like, oh, well, that actually turned out to be okay.
One other question from the chat. Do you know who the Fanny was? Any ideas?
Who the
Fanny was?
No, we did. I mean, De Quincey in Confessions writes about a woman named Anne of Oxford Street. And she only exists in that text. Nobody says, "Oh, I saw De Quincey out with Anne," or "Oh, I was out with De Quincey and he mentioned Anne." There's nothing. And so when I was writing a biography, if you're writing a biography of De Quincey in the future, if anybody's writing a biography, there's a problem with Anne. And I ended up thinking, De Quincey visited prostitutes a lot. Did Anne of Oxford Street actually exist? And I think the answer is probably she's some sort of composite of a series of different young women. De Quincey speaks with great bravery about prostitution and about how these people are forced into it by poverty and they should not be looked down on. He's very, I would say very, very open-minded and positive about why someone would do that. So, but I ended up thinking she probably wasn't real. And Fanny the Bath Road, does she, maybe she does. If someone's got a guide to Bath Road, the coach is on Bath Road, and we can find the name of the man who might have a granddaughter named Fanny, that'd be very exciting. But as far as I know, No, but I've got like 10 of those things in my life, like Anne of Oxford Street and Fanny of the Bath Road. Do they actually exist? Or are they, like so many other things that I said to Jane, are they a creation? You know, does he dream them up?
I enjoyed that talk very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Did anyone pay De Quincey back when he died? Did they write a sort of damning report on him, on his life? You know?
The question is, did anybody pay De Quincey back when De Quincey died? And the answer to that is yes. He was publishing his collected works in Edinburgh in 1853. The first volume came out, and De Quincey edited it. And it came out in 14 volumes, 1853 to 1860. The last volume came out after he died. It's called Selections Grave and Gay. He rewrites a lot of his essays. And I'm not a big fan of, oh, I'm going to do that again. You know, like I don't want McCartney to really re-release Hey Jude. You know, it was fine, Paul. We don't need it again. It was brilliant the first time. And so De Quincey sort of gets in there and messes around with a lot of essays. And some people are a real admirer of that, but I'm not. So when these collected works came out, there were some reviews like by George Henry Lewis that were very, very positive and enthusiastic. And interestingly, De Quincey was much more accepted in France than in England. In some ways still is more accepted in France. And I don't think it's just the De Quincey. And the person who was most enthusiastic about De Quincey was Charles Baudelaire, who wrote, of course, Le Paradis Artificiel, which is a translation of De Quincey's work. So the French were excited in translating De Quincey, and the English were, you know, somewhat disapproving. But the French were like, oh, this seems sort of interesting. And Baudelaire writes The Flowers of Evil, which has 4 or 5 opium poems in it. And when De Quincey dies, Baudelaire hears of his death and says, England has lost its most original mind. So that's from the founder of modern French poetry, that's very high praise. And then there were British critics who were disapproving in 1820 and 1830 and 1840 and 1850. So, you know, he produced, like any great figure, like what Wilde would say, any great figure produces, you know, if people aren't yelling about your book, Wilde would say you didn't write a good book, right? If you don't cause a controversy of some kind, you haven't done something very interesting. Right? So De Quincey did achieve that. And where's Chris? Chris, that in a way that is a kind of celebrity, I think. He made an impact, for sure. Yeah.
Will be the last question.
Someone else.
Just quickly on that note, actually, we were saying about he was very popular in France.
Yes.
Considering his own, polemics against them,
yes.
They presumably find that ironically funny? or was it more of a seeing through the prejudice to the artist as opposed to, you know, what was the French perception, I suppose, of his?
Well, for many, many people, the French version of De Quincey is the De Quincey of Confessions of an English Opium-Eater. And that book gets far, far more traction than any other book that it still does, which is why I start out by saying, oh, don't forget he does other things. And so Confessions is first translated in France in 1828. And it sort of launches this tradition of the French, you know, confessing about drugs, talking about drugs, which culminates, I would say, in the first instance in Baudelaire. And so the fact that De Quincey was rabidly anti-French at times, like around the French Revolution, doesn't really sort of impinge, because that's not the De Quincey they know. I was involved in a project to edit his works. There are 21 volumes. Like this edition here, that's up on the screen, that's a 1-volume edition. So 95% of his writing is left out. Well, when someone says to you, do you want to edit a selected edition? You say, yes, that'd be great. But it always is always a ghastly experience, because you got to cut so much. You got to cut 95% of what he wrote. And that's before any of the letters. So the De Quincey that the French knew was the De Quincey of Confessions. So Malcolm McLaren, you know, the guy who does who promoted the Sex Pistols, Malcolm McLaren says De Quincey is this wonderfully radical, original mind. And that's because he's read Confessions. If you read De Quincey on the French, if you read De Quincey on Asia, it's horrifying. You can't get much more closed-minded and bigoted and angry than that. You know, the British Empire is right. Let's just wipe out the whole lot. That's De Quincey, you know, that's chilling, difficult reading. And then he's also a bohemian who loves opium. And so, like that. Thanks.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you.
And just before we thank our speaker, I mentioned that this was the first in our series for this year. I'm delighted to say that Rob will be back again in March to talk about Regency women. But before then, we have a talk scheduled for the 13th of December by Geoffrey Marsh entitled Living with Shakespeare in the 1590s. So I hope some of you will be able to join us for that. But before we leave, I'd like you to all show your appreciation for a fantastic talk this evening.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Can I just say one more quick thing and then okay. 2 nights from tonight, on Wednesday night, my dear friend John Strachan at basketball, my colleague at basketball, and also my friend for 30-some odd years, has organized an event at the Holborn called William Wordsworth at 250. And John is one of the leading authorities on Wordsworth. And this event is free at the Holborn. And if you are interested in De Quincey or want to know what De Quincey saw in Wordsworth, this is a wonderful chance to come and learn about it. So if De Quincey is of interest or Wordsworth is of interest, it'd be lovely to see you there.